Hello, and welcome to The Complete History of Science, Series 6, Episode 3, Realdo Colombo and the Pulmonary Transit of the Blood. The publication of the Fabrica in 1543 caused a huge stir and made its author Vesalius arguably the most famous anatomist in Europe. Since antiquity, Galen had been the ultimate authority in the field, but the Fabrica contested almost all aspects of his anatomy. Vesalius, performing his own dissections, had claimed to have found over 300 mistakes in Galen. This challenge could not be ignored, and the Fabrica attracted both admirers and detractors. Some began to adopt its ideas immediately, while others denounced Vesalius and set out to disprove his claims. Vesalius, a combative debater, might have been expected to begin to vigorously defend his work, and yet, at this moment of great professional success, he decided to change course. In the autumn of 1543, he resigned as a professor in Padua and accepted a role as physician in the court of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. The reasons for this sudden switch are uncertain. One possibility is that he was seeking to fulfill what he saw as his birthright. 3 generations on his father's side had attended emperors until his father, born out of wedlock, was not allowed to enter university. It's possible Vesalius may have seen himself as restoring the family to their rightful position at the royal court. Another possibility is that Vesalius may have been hoping to secure royal patronage, which would mean financial security and prestige. He perhaps hoped that he could perform his royal duties while also continuing his research. If this was the case, he was in for a big shock. Not long after arriving at court, he was dispatched to war in the Low Countries, where he worked as a field surgeon for the emperor's commanders. Witnessing the blood of battle was a new experience for Vesalius, and one for which he was ill prepared. Vesalius was an academic authority, but at best an average surgeon, and lacked the practical knowledge of his peers. Dissecting corpses on a workbench is a world away from treating men writhing in agony, and this episode must have given Vesalius pause for thought. In December of that same year, Vesalius briefly returned to Padua, where he performed a public dissection on a young woman, whom the students had snatched from the graveyard in the church of San Antonio. This homecoming caused great excitement, and 500 people gathered in the small temporary theatre to watch. Vesalius, though, didn't linger. Leaving Padua almost immediately for Bologna, he met a friend and ally, Giovanni Bianchi. He was again asked to lecture, which he did, working late into the night to demonstrate the venous system for a small group of students. Early the next morning, though, he left, and it seems at this time he was determined to avoid being drawn into public debate. His last stop was in Pisa, where he had personally been invited by the Duke, Cosimo de' Medici. Here he gave a series of public dissections, drawing packed audiences of not only university students, but also the great and good men of Pisa. The Duke himself attended one of these lectures and offered Vesalius a lucrative contract to stay and lecture at the university. Pisa was amongst the most liberal of the Italian universities, and Vesalius seems to have been keen. Cosimo personally petitioned the emperor to release Vesalius from his service, though unfortunately for Vesalius, the request was denied. There's no record of Vesalius's thoughts at this time, but we do know what happened next. Vesalius burned all of his papers by throwing them into the fire. Years of notes and observations from his dissections were lost, as well as his unpublished translation work and annotations. At just 30 years old, Vesalius was done. The incident would mark a clean break with his former life, and for the next 2 decades, he resigned himself to his new circumstances at court. Despite the withdrawal of Vesalius from active research, the project which he had set in motion continued. In the 16th century, Italy was already the centre of learning in medicine and anatomy, and in Vesalius's wake, it rose to even greater heights. A new generation of anatomists emerged who were inspired by the Fabrica and ready to challenge ancient authority. The earliest and arguably most important of these was Realdo Colombo. Only a few months younger than Vesalius, Colombo studied anatomy and medicine at Padua from around 1538. He had arrived at Padua without a formal education, having worked initially as an apothecary in his native Cremona, before training as a surgeon for several years. Surgery was a practical rather than academic subject in this period, but nevertheless, it put him in an ideal position when he arrived in Padua. Colombo began to assist Vesalius in his public dissections and helped with the research necessary for the completion of the Fabrica. Colombo was at this time a student of Vesalius, but also a friend and one of the most enthusiastic proponents of Vesalius's new anatomy. During the later years, Vesalius was often absent while he prepared the Fabrica, so Colombo began to stand in. After its publication, Colombo was amongst the first people to use the Fabrica as a text in lectures. The first edition contained a dedication to my friend Colombo, skilled professor at Padua, most studious of anatomy. Unfortunately, the relationship between the two men soured. During a lecture in which he substituted for Vesalius, Colombo claimed that a vein, which Vesalius had denied, did in fact exist. Vesalius, in response, resorted to personal attack, calling Colombo an uneducated half-knower. Over the following years, this animosity intensified as Colombo continued to point out errors in Galen which Vesalius had not perceived. Even more troublingly, he accused Vesalius of having based some of his human anatomy on that of animals. In particular, he said that the description of the larynx, tongue and eye in the Fabrica were based on the ox. These accusations were true, and although Vesalius realized the issue, in the rush to publish, he had included many of these bestial descriptions. The split between the two men was cemented in 1544, when Colombo accepted the position at the University of Pisa that Vesalius had been forced to turn down. Vesalius seems to have never gotten over the bitterness, and a later edition of the Fabrica from 1555 eliminated all mention of Colombo. In fairness, Colombo doesn't seem to have ever resorted to personal attacks and wrote of Vesalius, "I have always mentioned him with respect, in private and in public, and his writings should not be wrested from the hands of the learned." Instead, Colombo recognized the practical difficulties which beset a work of the Fabrica's scope. He continued, "Yet such is the difficulty of anatomy that all things cannot be penetrated by one man, such that even the huge and important volume of Vesalius is not devoid of errors." For Colombo, the fight does not seem to have been born of personal animosity, but a real desire for truth. He stayed for 4 years in Pisa, where he began to conduct his own research. In 1448, he moved to Rome and accepted the chair of anatomy, a position he held for 10 years until his early death in 1559. During his lifetime, Colombo published little, but after his death, a volume known as De Re Anatomica was released. In one sense, Colombo's work was an imitation of the Fabrica, placing observation of the body as the guide to truth. Yet, there's also a sense in which Colombo was seeking to surpass the Fabrica. Not only was Colombo seeking to give a more accurate description of the fabric of the body, he was also seeking a better understanding of the body's functions, something Vesalius had neglected. In the Fabrica, Vesalius tried, with little success, to project Galen's old physiology onto his new anatomical observations. Colombo realized the issues that this caused, and so set out to re-evaluate the actions of the human body. Still privileging experience as a path to knowledge, Colombo concluded the only way to gain knowledge of the body's functions was to perform vivisections. Vivisection is the practice of performing surgery on a live animal. This dated to ancient times, and Galen, for example, had routinely performed vivisections for a live audience to demonstrate the body's functions. In contrast, Colombo adopted vivisection as a tool for research, working in private to observe for himself the actions of the body. This led to his greatest discovery, the pulmonary transit of the blood, or, in lay terms, the circulation of the blood through the lungs. The significance of this discovery was derived in part from the fact it directly contradicted a central aspect of Galenic physiology. Galen believed blood was created in the liver and distributed through the veins to provide nutrition to the rest of the body. But, in the traditional understanding, all organs must also receive vital spirit, which animated the body and gave rise to life. This vital blood, effectively a second type of blood, was created in the left chamber of the heart, where blood mixed with air coming down from the lungs, and then was delivered by the arterial system to the rest of the body. The problem which arose was that there was no obvious way for the blood, passed from the liver to the right chamber of the heart, to then reach the left chamber. Galen's answer had been that the blood passed through tiny pores between the chambers of the heart. The problem was that no one had ever observed these pores. Vesalius, following Galen, had carefully examined the heart, but wrote in the Fabrica he was unable to find them. No alternative explanation was offered by the Fabrica, and so the question remained until Colombo set out to resolve it. His solution was motivated by a simple observation. He noted that the lungs were the only major organ in the body not connected to the heart via an artery. Colombo asked what was so different about the lungs. Clearly, they expand and contract, which in his understanding implied that they received the vital spirit. But how could they, if they weren't connected to an artery? His answer was that the lungs must be the site of production for this vital blood or vital spirit. Galen had already recognized that some blood passes to the lungs, which is used to nourish them, but he thought that only air passes back to the left chamber of the heart. Colombo noted that this pulmonary artery carrying blood to the lungs was very large, carrying far more blood than could possibly be needed by the lungs. Likewise, the pulmonary vein returning from the lungs to the heart should, according to Galen, be filled with just air. When Colombo investigated this in living animals, he found direct evidence to the contrary. The pulmonary vein contained blood. He suggested a simple alternative to Galen's pores. The heart and lungs formed a partial circuit, where the blood moved between the heart's chambers through the lungs. Observations of the heart confirmed this. Colombo examined the valves of the heart and suggested correctly that these controlled the direction of flow of blood, acting as a sort of one-way gate. Blood flowed from the venous system through a valve into the right chamber of the heart. It then went through another valve up towards the lungs. On the return journey, the valves were positioned so that blood flowed back to the left chamber of the heart and then finally out through the arteries. It followed that if we accept that the valves are acting as these one-way gates, we must also accept that the blood transits through the lungs. Colombo did not dispense with Galen's theory entirely. In fact, quite the opposite. He made Galen's theory work with the observations. He still believed that vital spirit was necessary. The difference was that instead of air mixing with blood in the heart, this now took place in the lungs. Colombo's accomplishment was that he made the theory work without needing to resort to the unevidenced idea of invisible pores. The pulmonary transit of the blood was a major discovery, though Colombo has not always received full credit for it. A few years before De Re Anatomica appeared, a man called Michael Servetus briefly mentioned pulmonary circulation in one of his theological works. Whether he had heard about it from Colombo or vice versa is unclear, as there's no direct evidence of any link between them. The question of priority between them, though, is also somewhat mute. 300 years before either man, Ibn Nafis, the Arab physician, had already written at length about pulmonary circulation. Following the same observation made by Vesalius, that there were no pores between the chambers of the heart, he had come to the same conclusion as Colombo. If the question is purely who discovered it first, the answer is indisputably Ibn Nafis. By contrast, if we were to instead ask whose account is the most influential, the answer would undoubtedly be Colombo. Ibn Nafis's discovery was unknown in Renaissance Europe, and not rediscovered until the early 20th century. Likewise, most of Servetus's writings were lost after being destroyed by the Catholic Church. His work, which described pulmonary circulation, also contained various heresies, such as denying the Holy Trinity, and so he was burnt at the stake, along with almost all copies of his books. The difference between Colombo and Ibn Nafis was that Colombo was at the centre of what was fast becoming an anatomical revolution. Prior to this period, ideas were often forgotten as quickly as they were discovered. But in Italy at this time, something entirely new was occurring. In the wake of Vesalius and Colombo, many men who had never met the great anatomists picked up and carried forward their work. We'll continue with this next time. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I'm sorry it's been so long coming. I've got 3 more episodes planned to round off this series, which should be here before the end of the year. Until next time,